She grew up in a small place where people worried more about daily needs than dreams. Music was always around her, but never loudly. There was no grand piano in the house, no music room, and no one talking about concerts or careers in art. Still, sound mattered to her. She noticed how rain hit the roof, how footsteps echoed in empty halls, and how old songs on the radio could change the mood of an entire room. When she was young, she would sit quietly and listen. While others talked, she paid attention to tones and rhythms. She did not explain this to anyone because she did not know how. It felt personal, almost private. At school, she was the kind of student teachers barely noticed. She was polite, quiet, and never caused trouble. Her grades were average, and she never raised her hand unless asked. The school had a music room, but it was rarely used seriously. Music class was more about rules than feeling. Students were taught basic theory, simple songs, and expected to follow instructions. Those who showed early confidence were praised. Those who stayed quiet were often ignored. She belonged to the second group. At home, there was an old keyboard someone had given the family years ago. A few keys were worn, and the sound was not perfect, but it worked. She started touching the keys slowly, not knowing any rules. She pressed one note, then another, listening carefully. Over time, she began to remember which sounds felt right together. She played softly so no one would complain. There were nights when everyone slept, and she sat alone with the keyboard. No lessons, no guidance, just patience. She replayed songs she had heard, then slowly changed them, following feeling instead of instruction. She did not call it practice. It was simply something she needed to do. At school, teachers knew little about her interest. When music class came, she followed instructions like everyone else. She never volunteered to play in front of others. Not because she was afraid, but because she did not feel ready. She believed music should speak when it was ready, not when forced. Some teachers assumed her silence meant lack of skill. They focused on students who talked confidently about music or showed off basic abilities. When she struggled with written music theory, it only strengthened their belief that she had no real talent. No one asked how she spent her time outside class. She noticed the looks, the small smiles when she missed a note during practice. It hurt, but she did not react. She learned early that arguing with opinions rarely changed them. Instead, she kept listening, kept learning on her own. Life outside school was not easy either. Money was tight, and expectations were practical. She was encouraged to choose a safe path, something reliable. Music was seen as a hobby at best. She understood this and never argued. She did her chores, helped where needed, and kept her dreams quiet. There were moments when doubt visited her. Sitting alone, she wondered if she was wasting time. But then she would press a key, hear a sound that felt right, and the doubt would fade. Music was the one place where she felt fully understood, even when no one else was around. As she grew older, the gap between how others saw her and who she felt she was became wider. Teachers continued to underestimate her. In music class, she was rarely chosen to participate. When the piano sat in the corner of the room, covered and ignored, she noticed it. She noticed everything. One day, a new school event was announced. A simple performance, meant to show basic skills. Nothing special, nothing serious. Teachers joked lightly about it, treating it as routine. Students were encouraged to participate, but only a few were expected to do well. She listened quietly as names were discussed, none of them hers. She felt no anger, only a calm awareness. She had spent years preparing in silence. Whether anyone noticed or not no longer mattered as much as it once did. In the days leading up to the event, music class felt different. Teachers seemed more alert, watching students more closely. She stayed the same, calm and focused. At home, she practiced like always. No extra effort, no change in routine. She trusted the process she had built over time. There was a moment, just before everything changed, when she stood outside the music room alone. She could hear voices inside, laughter mixed with instruction. She took a slow breath. She did not know what would happen next, but she felt ready. This was not about proving anyone wrong. It was about finally letting her music speak out loud. For the first time, She sensed that silence would soon break, and when it did, nothing would be the same. And while no one else noticed it yet, the quiet girl everyone overlooked was standing on the edge of a moment that would reshape how she was seen forever. The day of the school event arrived quietly. There were no banners or big announcements, just a notice on the board and a change in routine. Students were told to report to the music room one by one. It was meant to be simple, almost casual, but the air felt heavy with judgment. Everyone knew who was expected to do well and who was not. She arrived early and sat near the back of the room. The piano stood at the front, polished but rarely used. It felt more like decoration than an instrument. Teachers talked among themselves, holding papers and sipping tea. Their voices were relaxed, almost playful. They spoke about schedules, about how long each student should play, and quietly about who would likely struggle. As students were called forward, some played confidently, others nervously. A few made small mistakes and laughed them off. Teachers smiled politely, sometimes offering encouragement, sometimes quick correction. The room stayed light, almost careless. When her turn came, there was a pause. One teacher looked up, slightly surprised, as if the name did not belong on the list. Another leaned back and smiled in a way that was not kind. There was a soft chuckle from the side of the room. Not loud, but enough to be felt. She stood up calmly. Her heart beat faster, but her face stayed steady. She had felt worse pressure sitting alone at night, wondering if her effort meant anything. Compared to that, this was manageable. As she walked toward the piano, whispers followed. Not cruel words, just sounds of doubt. A few students glanced at each other, expecting an awkward moment. Teachers watched with mild interest, already assuming the result. She sat down slowly. The bench felt colder than expected. She adjusted her posture the way she always did at home. Her fingers hovered above the keys. Someone cleared their throat. Another teacher checked the time. A voice from the front said she could begin whenever she was ready. The tone was rushed, casual, as if this part did not matter much. She did not start right away. She closed her eyes for a brief second. In that moment, the room disappeared. She remembered the old keyboard at home, the uneven sound, the quiet nights. She remembered every mistake she made alone, every correction she taught herself. A few seconds passed. It felt longer to the people watching. Someone shifted in their seat. A teacher raised an eyebrow. Then her fingers touched the keys. The first sound was soft but clear. It was not rushed or unsure. It filled the room in a way no one expected. The casual smiles faded almost instantly. The whispers stopped. She continued, letting the notes breathe. There was control in her movement, confidence shaped by years of quiet practice. This was not something memorized for a test. It was something lived. Teachers leaned forward without realizing it. One stopped writing. Another lowered the cup in their hand. The room, once loose and careless, grew still. As she played, emotions surfaced naturally. Not dramatic, not forced, just honest sound. The piano, ignored for so long, finally had a voice. A student near the door froze mid-motion. Someone who had been smiling nervously now watched in disbelief. No one laughed anymore. The teacher who had smiled earlier now looked uncomfortable. Not angry, but unsure. The kind of uncertainty that comes when assumptions are challenged. She did not look at anyone. Her focus stayed on the keys. Every note carried intention. There were no wasted movements, no hesitation. It felt as though the room had stepped into her world rather than the other way around. Time moved differently. What felt like minutes to her felt much longer to everyone else. The music held them gently but firmly. When the final note faded, silence followed. Not the awkward kind, but a deep pause. No one knew how to respond right away. She lifted her hands and sat still. Her breathing was calm. She waited, not expecting applause, not seeking approval. One teacher cleared their throat again, this time slower. Another nodded slightly, as if acknowledging something important but unspoken. There was no loud reaction, no clapping, just a shift, a realization settling into the room. She stood up and walked back to her seat. The whispers did not return. I followed her, but differently now. not with doubt but curiosity. Teachers avoided meeting her gaze for a moment. Papers were adjusted. Notes were written more carefully. The event continued, but the tone had changed. Every performance after felt measured against what had just happened. Quiet comparisons formed, unspoken but real. She sat calmly, listening as she always did. Inside, she felt no pride, no anger, just relief. She had finally allowed her music to speak. What happened in that room could not be undone. The laughter from earlier no longer made sense. The assumptions no longer fit. And while no one said it out loud, everyone understood that something unexpected had just entered their awareness. For the first time, the teachers who once overlooked her were forced to see her not as a quiet student, but as someone who carried depth they had never bothered to notice. The silence she created that day was louder than any words could have been. After that day, the school did not feel the same to her anymore. The halls were the same, the bells rang as usual, and classes continued like nothing had happened. Yet something had shifted beneath the surface. People looked at her longer. Teachers paused before speaking to her. It was subtle, but she noticed. She returned to her routine quietly. She did not tell anyone at home what had happened. Not because it was unimportant, but because she had learned not to explain moments that mattered deeply. Some things felt stronger when kept close. In music class, the teacher's tone changed. Instructions were given more carefully. When questions were asked, eyes sometimes drifted toward her. She answered when spoken to, nothing more. She did not seek attention. She had already said what she needed to say through sound. A few days later, she was asked to stay after class. The request was polite, but cautious. She waited while papers were sorted and chairs scraped against the floor. When the room was almost empty, the teacher finally spoke. There was an apology, though not stated directly. Words like unexpected and impressive were used. The teacher asked where she had learned to play. She answered honestly, alone, at home, over time. That answer seemed to surprise them more than the performance itself. There were questions after that. How long had she been playing? Why had she never spoken up? Did she read music? She answered simply. She had started years ago. She practiced when she could. She played by ear and feeling. She spoke up when she felt ready. The conversation ended without drama. She was told she had potential and should consider taking things more seriously. The words felt strange to her. She had always taken music seriously, just not loudly. Outside the classroom, a few students began to approach her. Some were curious, others shy. They asked how she learned, how long it took, whether she felt nervous. She answered kindly but briefly. She was not used to being the center of attention. At home, nothing changed. The old keyboard still waited in the corner. She still practiced in the evenings, touching the keys with the same care. But now there was a new awareness. Not pride, but clarity. She knew she belonged in music, regardless of who approved. Weeks passed. The school announced another small performance, this time more organized. Teachers spoke seriously about preparation. Her name appeared on the list early. No laughter followed this time. She noticed the difference immediately. Where there had once been doubt, there was now expectation. That felt heavier than judgment ever had. During rehearsals, teachers offered suggestions. Some were helpful, others unnecessary. She listened politely, accepting what felt right and letting go of the rest. She trusted her instincts. One afternoon, she was invited to play the piano during lunch break. Students gathered quietly. The room filled faster than expected. She felt nervous again, but this time it was different. This was not about proving anything. It was about sharing. She played softly at first, letting the room settle. Conversations faded. The usual noise of lunchtime slowed. Music found its space. People listened. Some closed their eyes. Others leaned against walls, still and calm. The piano was no longer decoration. It had become a voice. When she finished, there was gentle applause. She smiled briefly, then stepped away. That was enough. Teachers began to discuss opportunities. Music programs, outside classes, competitions. The words floated around her, but she did not rush toward them. She knew rushing could break things that needed time. At night, she sat alone again, fingers resting on worn keys. She thought about the laughter she once heard, the silence that followed her first note, and the attention that came after. None of it mattered as much as the simple truth she felt now. Music was not something given by approval. It was built in quiet moments, repeated choices, and patience. She understood that the world often noticed only after proof appeared. But she also understood something deeper. The proof had always been there, even when no one was looking. One evening, as she played a familiar melody, she changed it slightly. A softer ending. A longer pause. She smiled to herself. Growth did not always need witnesses. The next day at school, a teacher asked her opinion about a piece of music. It was the first time that had ever happened. She shared her thoughts calmly. The teacher listened. Respect did not arrive loudly. Came in small moments, in careful words, in space being made for her voice. She still walked the halls quietly, still listened more than she spoke. But she no longer felt invisible. The laughter from before had turned into reflection. The silence had turned into understanding. And though she did not know where music would take her next, she knew one thing clearly now. She would never doubt the value of her quiet dedication again. As the weeks moved forward, attention followed her more openly. It was no longer just quiet looks or careful words. Teachers spoke to her with interest now, asking what she planned to do next. Some suggested training, others mentioned programs they believed she could try. Their voices were respectful, but she could still feel the distance between their past doubts and present curiosity. She listened, thanked them, and returned to her routine. Inside, she remained steady. She had learned that sudden praise could be just as confusing as doubt. What mattered was consistency, not excitement. The school prepared for a larger event, something that involved parents and guests. Music was placed at the center this time. The piano was cleaned carefully and moved to a better position. For the first time, it was treated as important. She was asked to play again. This time, the request came without surprise or laughter. Still, she felt the familiar weight of expectation settle on her shoulders. It was heavier than before, but she carried it quietly. At home, she practiced with intention. Not longer hours, but deeper focus. She listened closely to each sound, shaping it carefully. Mistakes no longer frustrated her. They guided her. One evening, doubt returned briefly. Not about her ability, but about belonging. She wondered if she truly fit into the world others were now opening for her. The thought passed as she pressed the keys and felt grounded again. On the day of the event, the room filled quickly. Parents whispered, teachers adjusted papers, and students shifted nervously. The noise was louder than usual. She waited backstage, hands warm, breath slow. When it was time, she walked toward the piano calmly. The lights felt brighter. Faces blurred together. She did not search for approval in the crowd. She sat, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands gently on the keys. This time, she began without pause. The music flowed with ease, confident but controlled. Carried emotion without forcing it. The room settled into quiet attention. Even those who had never noticed music before felt drawn in. Teachers watched carefully. Some looked proud, others thoughtful. A few seemed to reflect on earlier moments they could not take back. As she played, she felt connected to something deeper than performance. This was not about proving worth. It was about honesty. When the final note faded, applause followed. It was respectful, warm, and real. She stood and nodded slightly, then stepped away. She felt calm. After the event, conversations changed again. Teachers spoke openly about mistakes they had made in judging students too quickly. Some even admitted they had been wrong. She listened quietly. Forgiveness came easily to her. Holding on to resentment felt heavier than letting it go. Opportunities continued to appear. Invitations, suggestions, paths opening. She did not rush into any of them. She took time to think, to feel what was right. At school, younger students watched her with curiosity. Some began practicing more seriously, inspired by what they had seen. She never gave speeches or advice. She simply played when asked and listened when spoken to. One afternoon, she found the music room empty. Sunlight fell across the piano. She sat down and played softly, not for anyone else, just for herself. In that quiet moment, she understood something important. Respect felt good, but freedom felt better. The freedom to choose her path, to grow at her pace. She realized that the laughter from before no longer held power. It had become part of a past she had outgrown. As the school year moved closer to its end, teachers treated her as a serious musician. But she stayed the same, quiet, focused, grounded. She had learned that recognition could open doors, but belief was what allowed her to walk through them. And though the future remained uncertain, she no longer feared it. She had faced doubt, silence, and judgment. She had found her voice within them. What came next would be shaped not by opinions, but by the steady hands she placed on the keys each day. Her journey was still unfolding, but one truth stayed clear. She was no longer unseen. Time continued to move forward, steady and quiet, just like she preferred. The excitement from the school event slowly settled, and life returned to a familiar rhythm. Classes continued, bells rang, and students moved through the halls as they always had. Yet for her, something lasting had changed. Not around her, but within her. She noticed how she walked now. Not louder, not faster, just more certain. She no longer questioned whether her effort mattered. She had seen what years of quiet work could do when given a moment to breathe. Teachers treated her with care and respect. Not in an uncomfortable way, but with sincerity. They asked for her input, trusted her presence in the music room, and sometimes simply listened when she played. There was no longer any doubt in their eyes, only understanding. As the final months of school approached, discussions about the future became common. Students talked about exams, plans, and paths ahead. She listened as she always did. When asked about her own future, she answered honestly. She would continue with music step by step without rushing. There was no dramatic announcement, no big promise. Just quiet determination. At home, the old keyboard still sat in the same place. The worn keys still carried her touch. She never replaced it right away. It reminded her of where she began. Every note she played there felt rooted, real. One evening, someone from the school visited her home to speak with her family. They talked about opportunities, support, and guidance. The conversation was calm and respectful. Her family listened carefully, surprised but proud. For the first time, music felt less like a distant dream and more like a possible road. She watched quietly as others spoke about her. It felt strange, but not uncomfortable. She had already proven what mattered most to herself. Later that night, she returned to the keyboard. The room was quiet. She played slowly, choosing notes that felt warm and steady. There was no audience, no pressure. Just sound and feeling like it had always been. She thought about the laughter from the past. It no longer hurt. It felt small now, almost distant. Those moments had shaped her, but they did not define her. She understood something important. People often judge what they do not understand. Not always out of cruelty, but out of habit. She had learned not to carry the weight of those judgments. At school, younger students began asking her questions more often. Some admitted they were afraid to try because they thought they were not good enough. She listened patiently and shared one simple thought. Start quietly. Keep going. She did not become a different person. She did not seek attention or recognition. She remained observant, calm, and focused. But now, when she sat at the piano, she did so without hesitation. The final school performance of the year arrived without tension. She played once more, not to impress, but to close a chapter. The music was gentle and thoughtful, filled with pauses that allowed the room to breathe. When it ended, the applause was soft but heartfelt. She smiled briefly and stepped away, feeling complete. As the school year ended, she packed her things and walked through the halls one last time. The same walls, the same floors. But she was not the same person who once walked there unnoticed. She had learned that silence could be powerful, that patience could shape skill, That belief did not need permission. Her journey was far from over. Music would challenge her again, test her again. But she welcomed that. Growth had never scared her. She left the building calmly, carrying nothing but her bag and her quiet confidence. Somewhere ahead, there would be new rooms, new pianos, and new listeners. But she knew one thing would remain constant. She would always trust the work done in silence. And whenever she sat at a piano, she would remember that first note. The one that changed how others saw her, but more importantly, how she saw herself.